A very warm welcome to all of you who are here. It gives the Florence School of Regulation immense pleasure to have authors of this particular book launch and eminent experts to debate about the various aspects of the books. So I would like to quickly introduce all of the speakers who are present with us here today. I'll begin with the authors. So we have with us Mr. Pramod Dhruv, who's the former commission of the Central Regulatory Authority in India. And we also have Mr. Sushanta Chatterjee, who's the Chief Regulatory Officer there at CERC India. And also the third author, Mr. Shrikant, who's not here with us today because of connectivity issues, but who's also a former faculty member at the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research. And we have with us today the chair of the section, Dr. Kirit Parekh, who is chairman of IRADE. Also our four speakers. We have Professor John Michel Blechon, who is the director of the Florence School of Regulation, who will be bringing and giving us questions from a bit of European perspective, probably. And then we would have Dr. Nicholas Ryan, who is the assistant professor at the Yale University with the Department of Economics. And we have Dr. Sanjeev Ahluwalia, who is the advisor at the Observer Research Foundation and also a former secretary at CERC. And lastly, we have the CEO of Tata Power, Mr. Praveer Sinha. So very, very warm welcome to all of you for this particular book launch. And now, part of a ceremonial launch of the book, I would like all of you all to imagine you're launching the book electronically. So I would like you to place your fingers on the mouse where we can officially launch this book collectively. So I would now request Marita if you could play that video so that we symbolically kickstart this event with that launch. Marita, could you play that video? Thank you, Marita. With this, I would like to officially hand the floor to Professor John Michel Blechon as the director of the school and the host institution to say a few words.
As you have seen, Florence School in India has a smiling face, and at Florence School, some gray hair. But we are Florence School, you know. We have been created by European energy regulators to help energy regulators to think together to respond to the new challenges opened by the European market and a bit later opened by climate response policies. And we are very pleased to have opened in India our first international center because India is a leader. It's a leader in many aspects, and you know, in innovation and engineering, but also a leader that we are going to see in a minute, a leader in renewable industry, renewable policy. It's an immense privilege and honor to have been asked to join such a group of high-level Indian leaders. We hope that we will help you to be better evaluated as you are, creating a new leadership. And I'm very happy to help this book being read, assimilated, and used to foster the best possible answers to energy challenge and climate challenge, including, as the book is also saying, including universal access to energy and affordable energy for all. That's what I was willing to tell, and I give the floor back to Shweta.
Thank you, Professor. On that note, I would like to invite the authors to present to the audience a intro or a brief into this lovely book that you have launched. So I would like to first invite Mr. Pramod Dio to take the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Kirit Parekh, Professor Jyomisha Glansha, Dr. Nicholas Ryan, Mr. Sanjeev Ahluwalia, and Dr. Praveen Sinha. We are missing our co-author Shrikant Modak as he is traveling. He has been a co-author with me for my earlier published 3 books over a decade and a half. They represent 3 stages in India's journey towards clean and green energy. The first one, Decentralized Energy Planning, Methodology and Case Studies, published in 1991, is based on my experience of setting up Maharashtra Energy Development Agency in 1986. In that phase, Ministry of Renewable Energy, which was called MNES, and State Energy Development Agencies were focusing on pilot and demonstration projects of renewable energy and conducting rural energy demand surveys and planning how to meet the energy needs of villagers. Strategic Management of Energy Conservation, published in 1993, was based on my experience of setting up of Energy Management Center, which has grown into the Bureau of Energy Efficiency. In 2002, I joined Maharashtra Electricity Regulatory Commission as a member. We were facing a challenge of determining the purchase price of electricity by cogeneration of bagasse from cooperative sugar factories. A very politically dominant sugar lobby was really chasing the commission. Similarly, due to the higher prices of power charged by the state monopoly MACB and various fiscal and tax concessions given by the central and Maharashtra government, many industrial units in Maharashtra had started investing in captive wind farms. So MERC faced this challenge of determining the tariff for these 2 sources, and MERC determined feed-in tariff for electricity from these sources. So Electricity Reforms and Green Power Development, published in 2005, defined the cost plus return methodology for generic tariff determination for these technologies. When I moved to Central Electricity Regulatory Commission in 2008, I, Sushant and others refined this methodology of generic tariff determination and extended it to other technology. The tariff we discovered in 2011 for solar was rupees 18, US 30 cents. Today, the tariff discovered for solar-based and competitive bidding has come down to less than rupees 2.5, something like 3 cents. The other sea change is the complete collapse of the market for renewable energy certificate that we had introduced to enable green energy deficient states to meet their renewable purchase obligation. These certificates represent the environmental attribute of green energy. So given the change scenario, our book critically examines the auction design for renewable, recommends reforms in the Indian version of auctions, makes the case for revisiting the policy on renewable purchase obligation and for enlarging the market base for seamless integration of renewable in the Indian power system. I would now hand over to Dr. Sushant Chatterjee to give more details about the book. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It's indeed a great day for us authors. In fact, seeing the book see the light of the day gives you relief, which is akin to what you experience after the pangs of a childbirth. So it's a great joy for us today to see the book, see the light. At the outset, I would like to convey my gratitude to the publishers of our book, the Sage Publishing, for posing faith in us, and also shaping our thought process through a pretty rigorous review process. I would also like to express gratitude to the Florence School of Regulation for hosting this event. In fact, we were looking for an institution which is neutral and also has wide global outreach. And FSR came forward with all the warmth at their command. So thank you, Dr. Glochon, Swetha, and your entire team for making this happen. We'd also like to thank the eminent panelists for agreeing to spare their time and share thoughts on the issues raised in the book. Last but not the least, the participants. Many of them have joined and are likely to join as we go along. And many of them would be institutions and experts in their own right to have participated today to boost our morale. As Dr. Deo mentioned, the basic idea behind the book was to generate debate around the key issues on renewable. We found the challenges were galore, but we chose to focus on the core issues of pricing and market design on renewable. We found them critical and must be addressed for this policy to take off in true sense of the term. And as you could gather from the profile of the authors, the book basically is a synthesis of perspectives of practitioners and an academician. Policy making is not necessarily always dictated by the doctrines of economics, even if the subject matter so demands. Social and political expediency often outweighs the economic considerations. And it's exactly this dilemma that we tried to capture through the themes of the book. But riding on academic freedom and the disclaimer that the views are personal, we also took the liberty of presenting a critic and bringing on table policy alternatives on pricing and market design on renewable energy. We have made a case for a rethink on RPO policy, on auction design. We have also pitched for a robust market design as future instrument for RE integration. We don't claim our views to be absolute, nor do we expect a tame endorsement. We would have a sense of fulfillment if the book is able to generate dispassionate discourse on this important subject of integration of intermittent renewable energy systems sources into the power system in India. I would not take much time because today we have invited the eminent speakers and the panelists to throw light on some of the issues raised in the book and also reflect on the larger questions around renewable integration. So without much ado, I would like to hand over the baton to Dr. Kirit Parikh to take the session forward. Thank you. Thanks everybody for attention. Thank you, and over to you, Dr. Parikh.
Thank you all. And I must first of all welcome all the participants as well as the authors and the panelists. I think there is no need to emphasize the importance of the book, because as we hear every day, India is being pushed and the world is being marching towards a net zero kind of effort. And there, renewables have to play an extremely important role. Climate change is really forcing all of us to give much more attention to net zero. In India, electricity sector is one of the major emitters. And if you really want to substitute other fossil fuels like petroleum products and so on, you will still need to have zero emitting electricity, which can then substitute them. So having renewables, working out a system where renewables can really grow, and that we can also integrate them in the system itself are extremely important issues that the book addresses. We have used in the past many policies to promote renewables. For example, the first thing we started was giving a accelerated depreciation to wind power plants. And we found that people were building wind power plants only in the end of the last month of the financial year, so that they can claim the depreciation quickly, inflating the cost so that they get a larger amount of depreciation. And there was a lot of plants were being built, at least some of them on the paper. So that didn't work out. Then we had feed-in tariff, competitively bid feed-in tariff for solar power plant. And that had become extremely effective in terms of, as Dr. Pramod Davis pointed out, that the tariff desired had come down from something like 11.5 rupees in the first auction in 2000, I think it was 11, to the latest auction to 2 rupees 50 paisa or so on. So that has really worked. However, it is not enough just to set up power plants. We really need to make people use that electricity that they generate. And there the DISCOMs, the distribution companies, have to be encouraged to buy this power from this. And one of the policies we have used is really renewable portfolio obligation, as well as no charge for transmission of renewable energy, transmission charges on renewable energy. And I think this has created certain amount of renewable growth, and that people are buying this. But our experience here has been that many states do not fulfill their RPO obligations. And the questions that will arise is what should we do that the renewables are absorbed and integrated? So I think this is really an important question that we need to address. So I think in this whole issue of considering how financially stressed the distribution companies in the country are, it is very important to bring some fresh thinking on this, and whether it is RE market and the principles under which it can be pricing or so on, or how do we restructure RPO, do we need it, and that whether how do we really promote what's the role that ancillary services can play in all these things. These are very important issues which the book addresses. And I think we know that the authors are extremely talented and versatile, and with a vast experience in a whole range of aspects of the power sector policies. So I really look forward. I've seen the book and I'm really happy to recommend it to others. But I'm sure that a larger, wider distribution of this book would really bring the kind of reforms that we really badly need in the country to push renewables and their integration in the system. With this brief introduction, may I invite the panelists one by one to make their comments. And who is the first one?
I think Dr. Glashon.
Dr. Glashon, please.
I'm not the first one, I'm the one speaking. You are the first one, Mr. Parikh.
Yeah.
And as I said, it's an honor for us to be invited to join such a group of leading Indian experts. And India also is become a giant in the renewable industry. And it is a duty for all of us, particularly the Westerners, to look at what you do and why you are doing is this way. I will speak for the Westerners, not because I have nothing to say to the Indians, but because I would plea the Westerners to acknowledge that India has become a leader and we have to learn from Indian experience. And this book is a fantastic book because it takes India as it is, it takes India's experience, and it compares India experience to others, including China. This is a surprise for me because it's not every day that Indians refer to the Chinese to say niceties and vice versa. And also, it explains it in the light of the modern economic theory, which is exquisite for me as an academic. So now I'm speaking to the Westerners. Ladies, gentlemen, you have to read this book, or at least to carefully listen what I'm going to tell you. There is 10 chapters. The authors are very well-known leaders in India. One has been chairman of a regulatory commission for 15 years. The other one is the chief of regulatory affairs at the Federal Regulatory Commission. The third one, I know less, and is not there, but only these two are really flagging the importance of the book. Now the content. The first 3 chapters are going to tell you what you do not know, which is India. India is independent since more than 70 years, and India did build a frame, institutions, rules, etc. 3 chapters will put you at a reasonable level of knowledge to understand the rest. The rest, from chapter 4 to chapter 9, it's pure practical economic reasoning, or if you have an engineer, it's practical implementation of things. Chapter 4 is looking at business models, but what you are going to discover is that India, in theory, has connected all villages to the grid, but in practice, many villages, many areas are not really fed by the centralized generation, but by local models. You will see not connected generation, you will see mini grid generation, and you will see several business models as pay as you go, and why India is not exactly like Kenya. It's very interesting to check. You will see also peer-to-peer, and you will see that many companies do not like much peer-to-peer and does not help it to grow. That's chapter 4. Chapter 5 is going to pricing renewable. And then a fantastic chapter, cost plus, market-based, auction, various auction, the Klemperer model of auction, why the Indian is a type of, but not exactly the same, Crampton, and a really very careful and very illuminating explanation of the auction model being used in India, and also a kind of nice word about the fact that China too went to auctioning to get prices. Chapter 6 is telling us that, of course, we have in India this pricing, but we also have renewable purchase obligation, and we also have energy certificates. We have all of this. How do they combine? Chapter 6 is looking at the UK case for renewable purchase obligation and compares with India, and is reminding us that India is both a federal country and a group of states being not independent, but different from one to the other. Very, very interesting to see. And also with different renewable resources. You have states with wind, states with solar, and states with not much wind, not much solar. So what do they do? Chapter 7 is looking at the certificates and is explaining us the role that the regulatory commission, the Federal Regulatory Commission, played into defining forbearance price, floor price, and also telling us again that in India we have federal authorities, but powerful states decision-making. Chapter 8 is looking at intermittency. Does intermittency impede to have a new, modern, more comprehensive, more coherent market design? Chapter 8 is saying, no, intermittency has to be taken very seriously because it's really a concern, but it can be dealt with in India as it is anywhere else. And then chapter 9, let's go to market design. The US have shown that locational marginal pricing works, and combining energy pricing and ancillary services pricing is efficient. The Europeans have done it differently with zonal and separating peaks and balancing markets, but it doesn't look so efficient vis-à-vis the future, vis-à-vis the many constraints that renewables are going to bring. And this chapter is advocating for using CFDs with a strike price coming from the auctioning and putting all renewables on balancing markets and, if possible, or if desired, in the day-ahead market. And then the last chapter, chapter 10, is only concluding on this, reminding us that today, 18 months ago, India was already at 90 gigawatts with a target of 175 gigawatts in 2022, I assume delayed because of the violence of the pandemic, and another target of 275 gigawatts in 2027. The only thing being less clear for me is the planning of the grid, because with such amount of renewable, planning of the grid is becoming really a key question, interconnection among states, and how to combine a national balancing and state balancing. But apart from these two questions, a fantastic book that I highly recommend all of you to read and to meditate. Thank you.
Shall I now invite Dr. Nicholas Ryan to make his speech? Maybe you want to present the slides. It's okay with us also.
Yeah, so firstly, thank you very much. Congratulations to the authors, Dr. Dio, Dr. Chatterjee, and Mr. Modak, who unfortunately could not join, but really a fantastic book. And I would also just personally thank Dr. Chatterjee. My research mainly concerns the energy sector and electricity markets in India. And I think of what little I know, he has taught me perhaps 3/4 or perhaps more. So really, I wouldn't be working in this field without his inspiration. And I think that for an academic, it's a pleasure to participate here because with genuine experts who are working in designing these markets, it's a kind of test for your own ideas, and you know that your own ideas are only viable if they can sort of hold up to such scrutiny. So with that as preliminary, I just want to briefly set the context for this book. And I think it's a book that's important, and it comes at an important time. And I'm going to give a few basic facts, which I think that most of the panel here will be familiar, but it might be useful to see it in a different way. So this is the growth in wind and solar energy generation around the world in about the last 30 years. So we heard about the change in price, which has been dramatic, and that change in price has led to an enormous surge in generation from solar and wind. So this is in petawatt hours. So 1 petawatt hour is a very large number, and you see that wind and solar have really taken off, and especially in the last 5 years. This is both in the OECD countries, basically Europe and United States, and then outside the OECD in the right-hand panel. So this looks like a triumph, and it's obviously highlighted the importance of renewables markets. But if you zoom back and say, what fraction are those renewables of the total electricity generation, it's still quite small. So this is plotting that same yellow and green, if you can believe it, but on a scale where you can also see generation from thermal sources. So the black portion is coal, gas, and oil, the brown portion nuclear, the blue portion other renewables, mainly hydro, and then wind and solar at the top. And so that surge in wind and solar, while it was very large, is still a kind of small slice of the overall pie. And so this book is a very interesting position because it's about how did that surge occur, but it's also about what is going to happen next. And what is going to happen next is really astonishing. So this is the status quo circa about 2020. And this is what is going to happen next as per the International Energy Association, or International Energy Agency, excuse me. So what they do is they have a scenario called the announced pledges case. And the announced pledges case basically adds up what various countries have promised to achieve as far as renewable capacity addition. And so the takeaway from this is that electricity production as a whole is going to take off because of the anticipated electrification of the transportation sector, such that by 2050, there is going to be more generation from solar and wind alone than there is presently all electricity generation in the world. Now, it's very possible that countries break their pledges and this is not achieved, but I think it puts the scale of the challenge into perspective. It's really hard to comprehend without some visualization. What this book does is provide a vision of how that might happen. And the authors are uniquely qualified to do this because they both sort of recognize what is needed, but also what is feasible. And what is feasible is determined as an outgrowth of how the sector has developed in India. And I would particularly point to chapter 9 on market design for renewable energy as a kind of landmark. I think anybody who is going to work in this sector and anybody who's thinking about what ought to happen to absorb growth in renewable capacity over that next 30 years should read this and heed its advice. And what I take as the kind of highest level advice is that the power system needs more market signals and more accurate market signals to allow the flexibility to absorb this sort of wave of renewables. Because the present system, well, a hybrid of markets and elements of planning, has served well in an era when power is relatively dispatchable, manageable, but will probably serve less well as the share of renewables gets larger and larger. And just to put sort of two concrete examples, this is from a sort of NREL report on renewables integration in India. This NREL report, this concludes basically that India is well poised to integrate renewables, but with respect to the target of capacity addition by 2022. So it doesn't speak at all to what would come, beyond that. And one of the things they say is, look, the renewable energy capacity addition is likely to come in places that are divorced from load, and therefore the role of markets is going to be to bring that energy from the place where it's generated to the place where it's needed. So, for example, from Gujarat to UP, where the left-hand panel here is showing where renewable energy is going to be generated, and the right-hand side is where is the load. And then the second sort of concern in renewables, of course, is what to do over time. And that is mainly because you cannot control when renewable energy resources are going to produce and to what extent, and they're only imperfectly predictable. And so markets need to be nimble in order to adjust to unanticipated fluctuations. And so in this NREL report, they run scenarios through a power system model regarding what the dispatch of power will look like, for example, in the southern region in July of 2022, when there's 100 gigawatts of solar capacity and 60 gigawatts of wind across the country. And so you can see in the bottom panel what that involves, which is big fluctuations in solar, which are partly offset by fluctuations in wind. But then the red portion at the top of the bottom panel, that red portion is curtailment. So that's basically renewable energy that is being spilled and not used. And I think that great care needs to be taken following the model in this book in order to avoid a scenario where a lot of renewable energy is added, but the power system is not flexible enough to put that to good use. So I'm just going to close with three basic high-level summaries. I think we're to get into the detailed proposals in the book a bit in the discussion, but what is the overall direction, and which I strongly agree with? Well, firstly, it's that there should be markets for each differentiated service. For example, to move away from planning-based mechanisms, penalty mechanisms based on administered prices, and towards mechanisms like ancillary services that would use market discovered prices to do this short-term balancing. And those should be differentiated in space and time. Secondly, that market integration is really essential because the imbalances I showed you are at an all India level. That is, there's a need for movement of energy across space, and that need is only going to grow greater over time. There's also a need to sort of integrate market horizons from long-term markets where most renewables have been added on long-term contracts into short-term markets to give efficient incentives for hedging of prices and for dispatch of sort of dispatchable, rampable resources to offset these fluctuations in renewables. And so that might involve the addition of new financial contracts that are not now presently common in India. And then lastly, and what I think is a real kind of great regulatory perspective here is that the authors propose, if you sort of read between the lines, getting out of the business of sort of arbitrating between renewable and non-renewable sources of energy. So this is like the true spirit of regulation, which is a spirit of neutrality. That is, the market should treat different energy resources as per the energy they provide, the timing of that provision and its predictability, but without regard to the technology and with no special dispensation favoring either renewable nor non-renewable sources of generation. And that's a sort of principle which, for example, in the United States, the FERC has slowly been working towards over many years, and which I think would greatly improve the efficiency of the power system. So that's what I have by way of introduction. Thank you again very much for the opportunity to read the book and participate in today's panel. I think this is a very wise roadmap, and basically there's no time to waste in putting it into practice, because that the yellow and green are continuing to shoot up, and the reforms that are advocated here are urgently needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ryan. May I now invite Dr. Sanjeev Ahluwalia to make his presentation comments.
Thank you very much. Shweta, can you hear me? Am I audible? Yeah, okay, good. Thank you very much, sir. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Not only because it's a very rare occasion that Indian regulators write a book, but also because of the galaxy of eminent people that one gets to meet, albeit one does so only remotely, and one hopes that will soon stop because, like everywhere else, India, I believe, is opening up. So, I read this book with an enormous amount of energy and pleasure because, firstly, it's very well written. And I think I'd like to give that credit, though I don't know who is responsible to the author who's absent, Shrikant Modak, because he's an academic, but for years he's also been a journalist and an editor. And the way the book reads so easily, technical subjects, awfully dull, repetitive things which we've been hearing over the last 30 years are spun across in a new way so that it becomes engaging to read. And there is a sense of energy in the book, which I think derives from the energy of the author's minds. Because all of them, though I don't know Mr. Modak very well, but certainly Shushanto and Deosa, I must explain to our foreign participants that in India we have a habit of adding the sir after the name rather than before, just to venerate somebody who's very senior. So it's not Sir Deo as it would be in Britain, but it's Deosa or Parik sir. That's how we do it. But it is only for Indians. You don't have to do that. You can follow the normal routine. So I think that, all of them are change agents, and they have been in their lives. And that comes through in the book. I mean, if I may just add for the information of the non-Indians on the panel, that, Dr. Deo kind of really rose in my estimation, not only because he became chairman of CERC, because in 2010, he stuck his neck out to do the right thing. I mean, it was a crazy thing, which can only happen in India. 2010, Tata Power was one of the beneficiaries, as was Adani and Hisar. These guys had set up mega power plants, coal-based coal being imported from Indonesia, some from captive mines. And Indonesia, and this was on a fixed price contract, where there was no scope for escalation except for force majeure type of things. And the Indonesians very cleverly just raised the export price of coal. As a result of which, these three companies came to the regulator, and Mr. Deo was there as the chair, and said, look, we have to pass this through, otherwise we're not economical. This is an action of a sovereign. There's nothing we can do about it. And of course, all the discoms, our distribution utilities, were totally against this, naturally, because they would have to pay more. And so there was a big ruckus around it. And in India, but it's very difficult to rule in favor of the suits, because you then run the risk of being called a suit boot ki sarkar, which translated into English means a government which is in hock with the industrialists, right? So it's okay to benefit consumers. Most regulators in India are pro-consumer, but there are very few regulators who also understand that the table cannot be tilted just one way, because if it is, then the table falls down. The table has to be level, and there are very few regulators who regulate in fairness for industry when it's required, and Mr. Deo was one of them. And I remember in appeal, his order was struck down, but it went up all to the higher judiciary, and it was actually it was a sensible order based on economics, based on fair play, based on transparency. And it took into account that our regulatory mechanisms for contracting are new. Stage as people. So I think there can be no better example of a really proactive regulator than him. And Shushanto, his incredible achievement is that there's something called the Forum of Regulators. This is something like the NARUC in the US, and they meet regularly. Most of it usually, when I was around, used to be just about tea and pakoras, which are snacks. But with Shushanto over there, he used the FOR, the Forum of Regulators, to actually develop a nationwide consensus around what should be the renewable purchase obligations that would have to be mandatorily, imposed on the discoms, so that renewable energy certificates would have to be earned and bought by them, which would compensate the renewable energy generators for the fact that their costs were being at an early stage of development, much higher than the costs of conventional energy. Again, I mean, exemplary work way beyond his normal call of duty, as is also the writing of this book. So I think these are three very eminent authors who are in the right mind and in the right time and the right space to try and bring to us a book which unusually actually provides a regulatory perspective to renewable energy development in a lower middle country like India, which has fairly high levels of poverty even today, and more importantly, whose carbon emissions are 1/2 of the average of the world and equal to that of the United States in 1867, right, a couple of hundred years ago, and 1/3 of China. But despite the fact that we can also be a crybaby, India actually is going all out there to say, look, we are poor, we are undernourished, our kids are undernourished, but we know that they'll be dead, or their children will be dead, if we don't do something about the climate. And so we are putting our money on the table. Sad thing, of course, which our friends, the regulators, don't mention, is the rest of the world is not living up to its commitments, but we are, and we're actually going beyond. That's the story of New India. And I'm glad that this book emphasizes that, but also emphasizes one negativity which has come with it. And the negativity is that when you compete with China, you know, markets seem like a very insipid instrument to follow, because the markets and the neoliberal theories are all going for a knock today, because China, with its enormous state power, is pushing through radical, significant technological change. And therefore, you know, a government like in India is really caught between two stools. What should they do? Should they rely on these very difficult to implement, uncertain, fuzzy market theoretics? Or should they just do what governments are best at, which is to direct and back it up with state money and push things through? Now, the solar program, which is the centerpiece of renewable energy development, is actually a mini Chinese kind of a program. There is enormous amount of public money through the banks, through public financial institutions. There are directives which are pushing the program, and industrialists, of course, are enjoying the largesse that is flowing today, as they should, because business exists for profit, and they will always try and maximize their profit. But I think the questions that do need to be asked, and lessons learned from the past. And one of them is from the wind energy program. The wind energy program, as nobody knows better than Dr. Kirit Parekh, began with a bang. You know, we were the second largest wind producer in 1997. And today we have disappeared in the wind league tables. The reason is, you know, the wind energy program was also fueled basically by subsidies. The ecosystem that developed around the wind program was not one which would sustain entrepreneurial energy, which would sustain commercial capital. We must avoid that in the solar power program, because otherwise we'll have a good run for 5, 8, 10 years, and then things will fizzle out because the wrong people would have got into the game. The wrong kind of entrepreneurs would have got licenses. Stranded assets will build up, and the system will just collapse. And we really don't have the financial leeway to be able to afford that. But I agree with everything that Nick has identified. And Professor, I'm going to murder your last name, Professor Blochon, is it? I mean, I'm sure I'm not saying it right. But, you know, all the things that you emphasized and the market, the market orientation that Nick identified. But I think that, and right now, it's a little difficult for India to actually go down that route for the next two or 3 years till all these targets have been implemented. And then we'll have to come around the markets after what the Prime Minister has said that we will do. So I will stop here with a massive, kind of resounding applause of congratulations to all the 3 authors, and very grateful that I was invited here and I get a chance to meet this galaxy of leading lights, a few of them who I know and venerate, and some who I will venerate in future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ahluwalia. May I now request Dr. Pravir Sinha to make his presentation comments.
Thank you, Dr. Parekh. First of all, my compliments to Dr. Pramod Deo, Dr. Shushanta Chatterjee, and Shrikant Modak for coming out with an excellent book on renewables. In fact, if someone wants to understand the renewable sector in India and how it has transitioned in last 20 years, what has been the challenges, what are the issues, and what is the way forward. This is an excellent book on what's happened and what needs to be done. I think it's very educative, but it is also very provocative, I would say, because it has raised a lot of issues and has said that this should be examined or this should be done. And I think it's very important when a sector like renewable is being discussed about, because there are compelling requirements from all sides. You have the traditional, the conventional generation, and they have their own challenge. And then you have the new generation, the renewable, and what it means when we go through that. The book actually is phenomenal in terms of not only talking about the context in which renewables has to be seen, but also the structural changes that have happened in the power sector and how they have an impact on the renewables, how the government policies over a period of time has evolved and has encouraged. When you do some of these policy interventions, it is at cost of someone. The transmission infrastructure and the ISTS, which is not being charged. It's not that there are free lunches over there. Someone else is paying for that. And there are a whole lot of questions that keeps on coming, that the pricing of renewable today is so low because there is someone else who is bearing the burden of the transmission charges and some of the other related issues. So this is something which is provocative to the extent that how do we address that? How do we address this concern? It's not something that can be wished away, but this is something which we need to comprehensively look at. It also talks about what are the other policy interventions that have happened from the government. And one of the big policy interventions has been the RPO obligation. While the government has come up with phenomenal interventions about encouraging the use of renewables, and the RPO obligation talks about it both for solar and non-solar obligations, the actual usage has been very, very less. And how the difference between the federal government and the state governments, how that gap can be met. Dr. Sanjeev Ahluwalia mentioned about the Forum of Regulators, and I think those are some of the areas where interventions would be required of an independent structure, whereby they can enforce some of these directions or the mandates from the government. Similarly, I think the book has come out with very good insights on how the renewable pricing can be done, whether it should be on a cost plus basis or the auction mechanism which is there. Again, I would say that there is no single answer or single methodology which is existing, and this requires a deliberation, more discussion on it, that how do we come up with a balanced thing and a balanced structure which brings in competition and brings in the best amongst the players, but also in the long term protects the interest, so that we do not have a scenario whereby there is a winner's curse and people who take the projects are not able to execute, and there are stranded assets like we saw in many of the other businesses where it has happened. Because at the end of the day, the state loses because the power will not be there, the lenders lose that, and also the investor loses, and it sends a wrong messaging to the investor community, not only in India, but globally also. So I think there has to be a very, very balanced approach, and an approach which encourages competition, but at the same time, take a more long-term perspective. And I think both Dr. Pramod Deo and Sushanta, being in from the federal regulatory system, they understand the pain that happens. This is a day in and day out. In their work, they would have been coming across large number of petitions where these issues are raised. So I think they have actually considered many of the challenges which people try to forget about it and say that competition will take care of it. It does not happen like that, and especially when we are talking of a public utility system, public service, where energy plays a very, very critical role in the growth of a country. And this has to be considered in a much more practical sense and in a much more doable sense, than rather than just getting carried away by the contractual definitions and the contractual boundaries. Another big area that I think the book has covered is about the REC, which is the market-based instrument. for the states and for the utilities to consider that? And what is the best way to fulfill the RPO obligation? Is it just by buying the certificates or buying the quantum of power? And what is the best mechanism of, again, pricing of these things? The commercial aspects is as important as the nuance of getting into the renewable business. So I think very, very important issues. Also, I think some of the fundamental issues that has been raised is about, especially when we are talking of large scale penetration of renewable, is that how do we use technology? And I was quite amazed to read discussions about the scheduling, forecasting, and deviation settlement, because these are some things which, again, everyone talks about the generation tariff and talks about so much of quantum of energy, but no one is talking about that. How do we efficiently do the scheduling of power? How do we do the load forecasting? And how do we do the load forecasting based on the generation forecasting? Because at the end of the day, there's no point in creating generation assets which are suboptimally utilized. So how do you bring out the matching of the generation assets with the load assets or the load profile? And I think the impact of it is the deviation settlement, but the solution in this is the better load forecasting and scheduling, which I think is a very important and a practical aspect that has been discussed in the book. Lastly, I think the market design, I think Sushanta is an expert, and some of the people from Florence School are expert. I don't understand so much, but it was good to read about that and get an insight on how to develop the market design, especially for renewable, especially when we are having so many competing requirements, and how do we ensure, especially in terms of the intermittency of the renewable generation, and is there an ideal market design that can be developed? This again is something that will require a lot of discussion and debate to get a full hang of where this can go and what is the best thing for a country like India. So once again, I would like to compliment all the three authors, phenomenal insights that they have brought in this book on the renewable. It's actually a compendium on renewable energy, and anyone wants to do a quick read and understand about renewable, take this book, 250 pages. You will get a good hang of it. You will be there. You will not be wanting to. You will not be lost out. You will get a very good hang of what's happening. And I think the way it has been structured, there are a whole lot of things that can be discussed and debated on this. And I'm sure all the people who are there today in the program and others who get an opportunity to go through the book will enjoy reading it as I have done. So once again, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for inviting me, and best wishes. I'm sure we'll get to read many more similar books on different topics, and your market design was phenomenal. I really get a good grasp of it and an insight on what can happen. So congratulations to the authors, and thank you once again for inviting.
Thank you, Dr. Sinha. I think now, if anyone from the audience has any questions, or if any of the panelists have any questions to any other panelist, please, Sanjeev, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. I just thought that, what Mr. Sinha said provoked me. So, I mean, not provoked me, it actually jogged my memory. And so I thought I'd just put it on the table that, one of the great things that implications from the book is that we are so bad. I mean, we don't have an open data system. For some reason, government is still shrouded. Even the most arcane things in government are shrouded in secrecy. So whatever data there is just not available to the public at large. And if it's not available to the public at large, unless and until the private sector goes and bribes somebody who's holding the data, which is happening in all developing countries, they can't get the data either. Now, for good forecasting of generation and demand and all that, and particularly when you have a large share of renewables, you are going to need more data in the public access sphere, so that generators and prospective generators can understand the business, can value the risks, and give the bids accordingly. But this is a very tricky business today. So I thought I would, this is something that we really need to. So in fact, I was about to request Dr. Kirat Parekh, who is basically the doyen, if I can call him that, of energy in India. I mean, for him to push this with government, that, if you don't put more data out in the public, how do you expect good bids? How do you expect people to be able to forecast how the wind is going to be blowing when the sun is going to be out, and how much demand? It's impossible. Second point, sir, scheduling, which was brought up again by Mr. Sinha, that the issue that the book has raised, sir, very rightly, is that these SLDCs, the state level system schedulers, 3 levels of schedulers: national, regional, and then state level. These state level fellows are not playing fair. Usually they are not playing fair with renewable energy, because the high cost renewable energy, the older plants, instead of transparently treating them as stranded assets and compensating them or doing something of that kind, they just don't schedule them under the guise that there are system problems. So you are barred from, evacuating your power. But again, if there are system problems, and if the system is getting interrupted so quickly, who is responsible for that? Shouldn't Power Grid be responsible for that? Shouldn't penalties be imposed on Power Grid for that? You see, because we talk about incentives, but unless and until there are negative incentives along with positive incentives, Power Grid is not interested in contesting what the SLDC says. RLDCs is controlled. The regional schedulers are controlled by the national, system controller, which is affiliated with Power Grid, but now there's a Chinese wall. But these chaps at the central and regional level, they don't interfere with what the SLDC does at all, even though they know that something wrong is being done. Now, there are 2 options for this. One is that you take away the power of SLDCs to schedule power completely. That is one. But that is a very blunt way of doing it. A better way of doing it, I feel, sir, is to absorb them into the system controller, the Indian system controller. There should be one controller, state level, regional level, and central level, so that there's no confusion, at least within the system controllers, on what is the right way to schedule, what is the right way to dispatch. Just 2 points. Thank you, sir.
Okay, anybody else want to say anything or observe something? Well, then let me ask some questions to the panelists if they want to. One of the things is that the book suggests is really a market design where market signals become, it's a competitive market and market signals become dominant. But questions in a system where there are externalities involved, and you want to push renewables because they have less externality. To what extent can you rely on market? This is an economist question, but I thought I will pose it. So anybody wants to respond to that? Maybe authors?
Dr. Nicholas Ryan has raised his hand, rightly so. He being an economist. So let's give him a chance first.
Please, Dr. Ryan.
Yeah, so Brilliant. So I think that that's a critical and important question. And I think also that surprisingly, markets in this environment might do a better job of accounting for externalities than would sort of regulatory interventions or administrative pricing. Let me give an example of this in the sort of question of what should be the sort of short-term pricing of deviations. So there's been enormous success in India in last 10 years or so with revisions to the deviation settlement mechanism, which is basically the pricing of deviations from scheduled power. And that has involved tightening the bands in which you're allowed to deviate, changing the nature of charges, differentiating charges by renewable and non-renewable generators in order to try to keep the grid stable. So you might think that, okay, the sort of regulatory hand in that market, as it's kind of a market because people still see and respond to those administrative prices, has done very well. So why not continue in that mode? And there's a sort of good case that renewables will actually just make this harder and harder over time. So for example, suppose that despite the public release of data, which I strongly support Mr. Ahluwalia's sort of advocacy there, that more data should be available, there's always going to be some error in the forecast. And so the question comes, should the renewable generator be penalized, be charged for that error? And if so, at what price? And the administrative answer is, well, here's a price, we can fix a price ex ante, and there will be some tolerance band, and outside that band, they would be charged. And so that would incentivize the renewable generator to produce on schedule. However, that will still not happen because it will fluctuate. And the question is that really the right price? Because, for example, it might be that you are a wind generator, you're fluctuating from your schedule because you're producing more than you expected. But in fact, that deviation is contributing to the stability of the system because you are offsetting an under generation by other solar generators at the same time. And so a market, unlike an administered price, could account for the circumstances of the deviation and what is your contribution to the stability of the grid in real time, based upon the conditions there or the price of ancillary services that was revealed. Because if you as a wind generator are providing more than your schedule, you may still be helping the grid at a time when ancillary services prices for additional dispatch would be high. And so the use of markets, when they're properly tuned and they're sufficiently fine-grained to account for this kind of temporal and spatial variation, can greatly improve over the kind of incentive you would provide with just a kind of fixed administrative price schedule.
You didn't answer my question. What happens with the externalities?
Yeah, so the externality is exactly of this nature, which is that, suppose that the traditional externality from a renewable generator is you produce more than expected, and so some thermal plant has to come and switch on and ramp up, and that's costly for them. So who pays for that? Is the renewable generator paying for that externality or not? And so under the system I'm describing, where there's an ancillary services market, they would basically be charged at the price of that ancillary service. And therefore they are paying for the externality that they've caused, but they're paying for no more or less than what they cause. So they're not paying for the generic expectation of an externality, they're paying for exactly the additional service that had to come on rather than just the fact that they've deviated. And all I'm pointing out is that the deviation itself is not costly, it's the consequence of that for the grid and the dispatch of other plants that may be costly.
I was referring to environmental externalities.
Pardon me. I was thinking in terms of power system only.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, of course, that is a delicate and difficult question. At present, non-renewable generators are not paying for the cost of the externalities to the environment that they impose. And so there's a legitimate question over whether that cost ought to be priced. I don't think there's been any discussion of that at a high level in India, whether one way to promote renewables as opposed to subsidizing renewables is to charge non-renewable generators for their external costs. But that would be the sort of efficient economic solution to impose such charges, but as far as I know, that's not on the table. So I was confining myself to the power system externalities because it's a whole nother domain of question.
Thank you, Dr. Ryan. Anybody else? Sweta, you wanted to say something? Please.
Thanks, Mr. Parekh. I just have, I would like to welcome our two discussants who are also here with their bundle of questions. And we also have some questions in the Q&A box. And I would like to request the audience, if you could drop your questions in the Q&A box, it would be easier for the panelists to answer to you directly there. So with your permission, Mr. Parekh, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Soni and Ms. Anjali to pose their questions to you and the panelists.
Sunisa, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Parekh sir. Thank you for this opportunity. First of all, I congratulate the authors. I have had decades of interaction with the two authors in their different avatars, and what a pleasure to see this book. Sir, you have filled in the vacuum in the space of Indian power market. The three keywords which I keep searching: Indian power system, renewables, and market. There are scattered papers, but you very rarely see such a compilation. So whenever I meet IEEE, CGRE, and other groups, they say that where is some compiled thing? Now I have one, we can give it to them. So thank you very much, sir, for this. And this is one of the maiden books. I don't think there is still any book of this kind, and it's by practitioners, decades of experience. So, sir, that's, I mean, you need many congratulations, and there are learned panelists who have covered it all well. Dr. Gleshan and Dr. Aluwalia, Dr. Nick Ryan, Dr. Sinha, all of them have covered. So I will, sir, come up with a very few basic naive questions as a hardcore practitioner, sir. And that is, RE marginal cost being low or almost negligible is single part, or should we move to multi-part? A very fundamental question which keeps bothering me. I am a student, partly of economics, partly of power system, but where to fit in this zero marginal cost as far as formulation is concerned. Hydro, we have zero cost, but we have done anyway. I mean, you all know, understand it. So the other part is, sir, that, sir, we are proud of our Indian grid. And we are proud of our all India markets, and you all have made it happen. And now we are taking pride in integrating large scale renewables. So the fact that RE is non-dispatchable, but we have gone for scheduling of RE. We have gone for a deviation. There are nuances, as Professor Nick Ryan mentioned, but we have been able to do it to a very large extent. That's something we would like to understand further on this. So the third point, which is very important, sir, for all these things to happen, is the ecosystem. The hygiene factors at the ground level for the market to work at the state level. Dr. Aluwalia raised about the state level. The entire ecosystem for any design of the market has to be created. And this is my feeling, being again a practitioner in the power system side. So I would not take much time. I am sure, sir, that this book must be a must read for all the newcomers and even the experts. Thank you very much. Congratulations once again. As a country, we take pride in this book. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. I think there is been a question to Dr. Gleshan. Would you like to respond to that?
Oh, you are very kind. First, I would like to say that Indians are very entitled to be proud of what they do. It's real. So I said it, I'm repeating it. Now, something else. Renewable is not dispatchable. And then, is demand dispatchable? So, renewable is only changing the level of demand addressed to dispatchable plants. I agree that when you will have much more renewable, it will become an issue. But as long as you have a limited amount of renewable, you only have the fact that demand is changed. Demand is lower. Where is the issue having a demand lower? It happens every day. It happens. It's not new. You are not discovering it. I agree that what we in Europe, you in India, and our friends in US, Texas, California, etc. What we are discovering is on distribution grids, we are not used to see injection in distribution grids. We are not used to have distribution grids having two-way flows. This is an issue. And it's an issue in EU because our distribution grids have been built to be passive, to be end of the chain. Transmission grid was doing the job, but not the distribution grid. So this, I agree, is a concern because everywhere distribution grid is a weak part of the grid. Even in US, it's the same. Huh? And I know that in India, your distribution grids are being, let's say, submitted to very excessive price control, and therefore they may have difficulty to answer what they are facing. Now, if the book is also saying that in the future, demand response can be improved, storage can be improved, so there is also in the future ways of dealing with intermittency of the renewable. While I agree with the book and with the speaker that forecasting of renewable has to increase and measuring of renewable injection has also to increase. That's the remarks I was willing to make.
Thank you, Dr. Klaassen. Before I conclude, may I ask the authors they would like to make any comments on any of these? Any response?
Sir, we have, in fact, spoken what we had to through the book, but then we thought that we will use today's platform to learn more and understand the nuances based on the issues that we have highlighted. But just briefly on the market design, sir, I mean, not specifically touching on the question on externality, but then the basic idea that we have sort of advocated is that you can create a robust market design to address many of the issues which you are trying to address administratively to integrate renewable. Must-run status is one example. Sir, we have been, the wind and solar have been crying for must-run status. We have sort of assured must-run status through our grid code, but that remains far from reality. So what basically we are saying that since it's a zero marginal cost power, if you can bring these RE sources into the market, must-run gets assured on its own. You don't need regulatory support or a policy support to grant them the must-run status. That's one. Second important claim or the demand that they pose is in terms of their balancing requirement. There's a lot of variability. So what we are saying is that you bring them onto the market, let them participate in the day-ahead market, correct their position closer to the real time in the real-time market. What we are saying is that bring in a 5-minute market instead of the current 15-minute market. Because if you can bring in a market design which runs an organized platform closer to real time, you don't need again the regulatory and a policy support in terms of special dispensation on balancing. Even the balancing cost, the need for reserves itself will come down substantially. So basic idea behind the advocacy of a robust market design in integrating renewable is woven around this fundamental construct. So that's one point which we feel possibly is a strong message which we want to give, because as practitioners, I mean, being in while practicing regulation, we possibly quite often get constrained by several constraints. But as an academician or as a researcher, when you write, you have the freedom and you can bring on table an idea which you feel could possibly be pursued in the days to come. So that's in brief from my side in terms of the vision of the market design that we have, and we tried to bring on the table through these books.
Thank you, Dr. Chatterjee. Now, let me respond to some of the things. I think what the panelists have said is this extremely readable book, very informative, very knowledgeable, worth looking at it, filling a gap and whatnot. I think it's really a very well-deserved praise that comes from various panelists for this book. I certainly agree with what you said, Liz. Now that, you know, market design should really try to minimize the intervention that is needed. And we have currently lots of intervention, and you have tried to go to a system where the design, it minimizes the intervention. You said that having a book published is like seeing the son of a child. Then I can only say, Ashtaputra Putrivan Bhavet. May you have 8 children, at least. So that is one thing. Sanjeev suggested that, you know, we need to do something about making data available freely. You know, I tell you that the data for national sample surveys, raw data, were not available to researchers for many years. And I struggled for at least a decade to persuade them to make it available. It's only happened when once Prime Minister, you know, almost a fleeting Prime Minister, you could say, Gujral, had a talk, and at the talk there was a tea. And I said, sir, you are talking about transparency and openness, but this data is not available. And he directed his secretary, Montek Ahluwalia, to address this issue immediately. And that is when the data finally become available to this. But it is certainly a huge struggle for researchers and others to get the data out of the government. And I think hopefully we will get someone who would say that this is to be done quickly and that it has to be done. I think the second few other points I would like that the whole business of stranded assets, it's not just a question of coal power plant becoming idle or something, but it is also the large amount of employment they have, the discoms, and what they do with it. And we need to design strategies for making it easier for them, you know, have a VRS strategy or give some kind of compensation or whatever it is that is needed to make it. Because as you know, that very sensible policies on agricultural farm pricing reforms is now opposed by farmers from Punjab. For more than a year, they are just agitating against it. And so this is a huge issue for any kind of a reform that we want to make. That doesn't mean that you should not really advance and advocate the kind of reforms that you are advocating. And I completely agree with most of the things you have suggested. As I said, one concern I had was about the environmental externality, but I think that can be taken care of with an appropriate regulation of pricing. The other, but there should be minimized intervention in this case. Another question that someone has asked, that if we have a huge renewable share, what happens when the market failure takes place? Now, I think, of course, any kind of a market failure, the regulators have to step in. But with a huge renewables, because renewables have many small and dispersed producers, and with open access, many consumers all over. The market would be truly competitive, and therefore there is no purpose, less chance of a market failure here than otherwise. But let me conclude by saying that I think this was a very rich discussion. People have made excellent comments, and that I think that the book reads extremely well, which has been pointed out. And I think that's really worth mentioning, because otherwise many technical book dealing with technical subject get lost, and people should really be made aware that this is an extremely readable book. The other comment that somebody has made, is the book available on Kindle? I think we should make it sure that it's available on Kindle, so that it is widely used and read and so on. So with that, I thank you all participants, all authors, and the organizers for asking me to chair this wonderful occasion. And thank you all, and congratulations.
Shweta, last word.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Parekh, for chairing the wonderful debate. And I would like to once again thank the authors for choosing the Florence School to host your book launch. We are proud again to publish your book through our various platforms and promote it. And I would like to thank the panelists for engaging in a wonderful debate. And we look forward to continuing these discussions in our other debates and in different platforms and avenues. So we look forward to those thoughts and continued debates on that. And lastly, I would like to thank the audience for participating and asking us questions. If we have some more questions, we'll try and address them back through emails or when we share the recording of this video. But in the meanwhile, I encourage you to go check out the publication. And yes, to confirm, we do have a Kindle version. If you go to the Amazon website, you'll be able to procure the Kindle version or the hard book or the paperback version. So I would like to invite you all to go and explore the book, and probably we'll organize a follow-up after you have read the book. So with that, I would like to wish you all a wonderful evening and a good afternoon and morning to those of you on the other side of the world. And see you all soon. Thank you for attending. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Long life renewable energy in India.
Thank you.